Ebony Brews was the heart of the city. Its warm, inviting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air, making it a favorite gathering spot for everyone. The cafe was cozy yet modern, a blend of sleek furniture and comfy corners where you could sip coffee for hours without being rushed. Regulars came in daily, busy business people typing away on laptops, young couples chatting over cappuccinos, and students buried in textbooks, all united by one thing: the rich, aromatic coffee that Ebony Brews was famous for. Yet there was a mystery that hung in the air, a question no one ever seemed to ask. Who owned this place? Despite the cafe's success, the name of the owner was a mystery. Most people didn't even know what the owner looked like. Ebony Brews had become a city landmark, but the person behind it was a ghost. The truth was that the cafe had been created by David Carter, a quiet, soft-spoken black man with a deep love for his city and its people. David wasn't just the owner of the cafe. He was also a silent benefactor, often giving back to the community in ways no one knew. Every week, David would personally deliver meals, blankets, and coffee to the city's homeless. He was a philanthropist, a man with a heart as big as his dreams. But you'd never know it just by walking into his cafe. David had worked hard to build Ebony Brews, and he took great pride in how much it meant to the people who visited. Yet, despite his success, he often felt like an outsider in the very place he had created. The customers loved the cafe, but how many truly appreciated who he was? Who he really was? One morning, David decided he wanted to find out. He had always been content to remain in the background, overseeing the cafe's operation from his office, letting his staff take the spotlight. But today, he wanted to experience something different. Today, he would step out of the shadows and become a part of the cafe's everyday life. But no one could know who he was. He decided to wear the uniform of one of his servers and see how people treated him when they didn't know his identity. It was a risky move, but David was determined to learn more about the cafe's true atmosphere. The plan was simple. He would take orders, serve coffee, and interact with customers, all while keeping his identity a secret. His staff, who adored him, were hesitant at first. They didn't want to see their beloved boss put in such a position, but David was adamant. After all, he wanted to understand what his customers really thought of the place and the people who worked there. As he slipped into the familiar apron and set out to start his shift, David's heart raced a little. This was not the role he was used to. He wasn't just a businessman today. He was a waiter, a face in the crowd, someone completely anonymous. The cafe was busier than usual when David entered the main dining area. The steady hum of conversation filled the space as he began to take orders, move between tables, and serve drinks with a practiced grace. At first, it seemed like any normal day. He greeted regular customers with a friendly smile and took their orders just as the other waiters would. But soon, he began to notice something unsettling. There was a shift in the air, a subtle tension that was hard to ignore. Some customers, even the regulars who had come in for months, looked at him strangely. They seemed to avoid eye contact or quickly glance at him before turning away. A few wouldn't even hand him their menus, instead flagging down other servers who were passing by. David remained calm, his smile never faltering, but the small pangs of disappointment began to accumulate inside him. "Can someone else take my order?" one man muttered as David approached with a notepad. His tone was dismissive, barely meeting David's gaze. David's heart sank a little, but he didn't let it show. He nodded politely and walked away, trying to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want to let his experiment interfere with his professional demeanor. But with each passing table, the reaction seemed to grow colder, more distant. It was as if they were uncomfortable with him, not because of anything he did, but because of how he looked. The longer he worked, the more the pattern became clear. Some customers treated him like a mere servant, a nameless face. It stung in a way he hadn't expected. He had always known there were biases in the world, but to experience them firsthand in his own cafe, this was something different. As the day wore on, David found himself at the back of the cafe, watching his staff interact with the customers. His employees, who knew him well, seemed to notice the shift in behavior too. They shot him concerned looks but said nothing, unsure how to address the discomfort. David could see that they were loyal to him, but even they didn't know how to handle the situation. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that this was all part of the experiment. He needed to learn, to understand why things were the way they were. But it wasn't easy. The weight of the subtle rejection felt heavier than he had anticipated. But just as he began to feel discouraged, something unexpected happened. A woman walked in. Someone who had never been to Ebony Brews before. Someone with an air of quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room the moment she stepped through the door. Her name was Clara. She was a social worker, a passionate advocate for the homeless. And though she had heard of the cafe, she had never taken the time to visit until now. As David approached her table, he noticed something strange. Clara was staring at him, not with the usual disinterest or discomfort he had gotten from the other customers, but with recognition. David smiled politely, ready to take her order, when she suddenly froze. "Wait," Clara said, her voice rising with realization. "You're David Carter, aren't you?" David blinked, startled. How did she know? She leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "You're the one who organizes the food drives at the shelter, and the one who paid for the repairs at the youth center. I've heard so much about you." David's mind raced. How could she know? He had never revealed his identity to anyone, except for his close friends and the staff. But before he could respond, the cafe fell silent. The other customers, who had been too busy or too uncomfortable to acknowledge him earlier, now looked up, their expressions shifting from indifference to shock. They began to murmur among themselves, exchanging whispers, as the truth dawned on them. The man they had been avoiding, the man they had treated like any other waiter, was none other than David Carter. The man who had built this very cafe, the man who gave back to the community in ways they couldn't even imagine. Clara's words had unknowingly started a chain reaction, and now, all at once, David's identity was revealed. It was at that moment that the energy in the cafe shifted. The whispers grew louder, and customers began to exchange glances. Some looked embarrassed, others confused, but all were now fully aware of the man they had so thoughtlessly overlooked. And as the revelation spread, David couldn't help but wonder, would things change now? Would the way he was treated, the way people saw him, shift because they now knew who he truly was? David didn't have to wait long to find out. As the hushed whispers spread across the cafe, David could feel the energy in the room shift dramatically. It was as if the entire atmosphere had changed with a single word from Clara. Suddenly, he wasn't just a waiter in an apron. He was David Carter, the man behind Ebony Brews, the person who had built the cafe from the ground up and given so much to the community without anyone ever knowing. Clara, still sitting at her table, looked at David with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "I can't believe it. You're the one. You've done so much for this city. And here you are, serving coffee like it's nothing." David managed a smile, though his heart was heavy. The realization was sinking in, not just for Clara, but for everyone else in the cafe. As more people started to recognize who he was, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to shame. A man who had been ignored, avoided, or treated dismissively by some of his regular customers was now the very person they had been silently overlooking. One by one, the customers' faces changed. The middle-aged man who had refused to let David take his order earlier now stood up, nervously adjusting his glasses. He took a step toward David, his voice filled with regret. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't realize who you were. I'm so sorry. Please, I didn't mean to." He paused, clearly flustered. "I've always loved this place. I had no idea it was yours. I'm embarrassed." David looked at him, his smile still warm. "There's no need to apologize. It's okay. You didn't know," he replied softly. "But we can always choose to be better. Just treat everyone with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are." The man nodded quickly, his cheeks reddening in embarrassment. He quickly returned to his seat, his eyes downcast. And then, something unexpected happened, a ripple effect. Slowly, almost awkwardly at first, other customers began to stand up. A young woman who had been sipping her latte from the corner booth came over. She wasn't a regular, but she had heard of David's reputation for generosity. She smiled hesitantly, not quite sure how to begin. I had no idea, she said softly, her voice filled with a sense of wonder. I've heard about your work with the homeless, but I didn't know you were the one behind this cafe. Thank you for everything you do. She gave him a small bow of respect, and David felt his chest tighten with emotion. It wasn't the words, exactly, but the sincerity behind them. The cafe that had felt so cold to David just moments ago was now alive with warmth. The customers who had once avoided him were now approaching him, offering apologies, nods, and grateful smiles. The shift in energy was palpable. It was as if the simple act of recognizing his humanity and his contributions had unlocked something in all of them. But the most unexpected moment came when a man sitting at a table near the window stood up. David recognized him as a regular customer, someone who came in every day but never really took notice of the staff. The man, who had always been polite but distant, walked toward David with a hesitant look in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice low and a little shaky. "I don't usually talk to people much, but I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I've been coming here for months, and I never once considered who you were or what you might be doing outside of the cafe. I didn't even realize I was, well, being rude. But now that I know what you've done for this city, I feel ashamed. I'm sorry." David's heart stirred with a mixture of emotions. He had always known that people tended to judge based on appearances, but to hear such genuine remorse was both unexpected and humbling. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his voice steady and kind. "You don't need to feel ashamed," David said. "What matters is what we do from here on out. It's never too late to start seeing people for who they truly are." The man nodded gratefully, his face softening as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He returned to his seat, but the energy in the cafe had completely shifted. The cold, indifferent atmosphere was replaced by something warmer, something more human. It was as if, in recognizing the man behind the coffee house, they had also come to realize the value of kindness, respect, and empathy. But just as David began to feel the tension ease, something unexpected happened, a twist that left him momentarily stunned. As the room continued to murmur and customers exchanged apologies, the door of the cafe opened with a soft jingle, and a new customer entered. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with a confident stride and a look of purpose in his eyes. He took a quick glance around the room, then made his way to the counter where David stood, still processing the flood of emotions from the earlier exchanges. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he approached. "I'm looking for the owner of this cafe," he said, his tone abrupt and businesslike. "Is that you?" David froze for a moment, caught off guard by the man's directness. He had thought that after the revelation, everything would calm down, but this man's presence felt different. There was something about him that didn't sit quite right. The sudden seriousness in his voice sent a chill through the warm atmosphere. "Yes, I'm David Carter," David replied, his voice steady. "How can I help you?" The man raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking over David with a hint of curiosity. "I've heard a lot about this place, but what I'm really interested in," he paused, his eyes scanning the room, "is whether you're willing to sell it." David's heart skipped a beat. Sell? Sell the cafe? For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The customers who had been chatting and laughing just moments before fell silent. The idea of someone wanting to buy Ebony Brews, the very place that had become a community hub, felt like an affront. It was more than just a business. It was David's dream, his labor of love. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice calm but firm, "but Ebony Brews is not for sale." The man's smile faltered for just a second before he quickly recovered. his expression unreadable. "Well, I thought I'd ask. You never know, right?" David nodded, his pulse racing. The conversation fell off, and he could sense that this wasn't the last time he'd hear from this man. There was something about him, something David couldn't quite place, that made him uneasy. As the man turned to leave, David watched him go, a knot of suspicion tightening in his stomach. But as the door swung shut behind him, the energy in the cafe slowly returned to normal. The murmur of conversation resumed. The smiles and laughter began to flow again, and the customers who had just apologized now felt lighter, more connected. David stood there for a moment, absorbing the events of the day. He had come in seeking answers, seeking to understand how people truly saw him. What he hadn't expected was to uncover not just the biases that some of his regulars held, but also the deeper complexities of human nature. And yet, despite the awkwardness, the discomfort, and the surprising twist of the businessman's visit, David felt a sense of peace. He had made a difference, however small, in the way people interacted with each other. And even if the cafe's future was uncertain in ways he hadn't anticipated, he knew that this day, this experience, had opened eyes. It had reminded everyone that it's not enough to see the surface. You have to look deeper, beyond the first impression, to truly understand who someone is. David returned to his office at the back of the cafe, his heart still heavy but a little lighter, too. Sometimes, it took an unexpected shift, a little discomfort, or even a revelation to make people see the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Ebony Brews had always been about. To create a space where people could learn, grow, and treat each other with the respect they all deserved. And David knew, even if only for a moment, that he had made a difference.